John Miller, a seasoned fisherman, never imagined that a simple discovery on the beach would change his life. When he found a giant clam containing a priceless pearl, it set off a chain of events that put his family in danger. As tensions rise, can John protect what truly matters? Like, subscribe, and comment your thoughts on this gripping tale of family sacrifice and hope. John Miller lived in a small house perched on the cliffs of a quiet coastal town in Oregon. The house, worn by years of salty winds and time, offered a breathtaking view of the endless sea. For John, life was simple: wake up early, fish until dusk, then spend the night preparing for the next day. His world was defined by the rhythm of the ocean, something he had known intimately for over 5 decades. His son Ben had grown up in this same world. But after years in Portland working in finance, Ben had come back home seeking peace after a series of career setbacks. He thought returning to the calm of the coast would bring clarity, a break from the chaos of the city, and perhaps a chance to reconnect with his father. However, Ben soon realized that reconnecting with John was not going to be as easy as he imagined. John, ever the silent man, had never spoken much about his feelings. After the death of his wife Eleanor 5 years ago, he became even more distant. Ben, back home after years in Portland, had hoped to reconnect, but found that John's life was consumed by his solitary routine. Every attempt Ben made to bridge the gap only deepened the distance between them, as John never spoke about his grief or how he had raised Ben alone. One evening, they sat together in the quiet of the living room, the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks below. Ben turned to his father, trying to start a conversation. "I'm glad I came back, Dad." He said the words feeling hollow in his mouth. It was what he thought he should say, but it didn't come from the heart. John glanced up briefly, then nodded, offering a faint, non-committal smile. "Good to have you home," he replied simply. It was all he said, nothing more, and Ben could feel the weight of the silence growing thicker between them. Ben looked out the window at the ocean, the same one his father had looked at for decades, and felt a sudden wave of frustration. He had hoped for more than this, more than the quiet, more than the coldness. Ben had imagined his return would feel like a homecoming, like a fresh start. But instead it felt like a continuation of the same isolation that had always been there. The next day, as they prepared for a day on the boat, Ben thought about how they had once been close. He remembered a time long ago when he would sit next to his father on the dock watching him work. They had laughed together, talked about everything and nothing. But that seemed like another lifetime now. Ben tried to remind himself that maybe things could change, that time could heal the distance, but deep down he wasn't so sure. John didn't seem to share the same hope. He had his routine, his world, and Ben had no place in it. As they loaded the fishing gear into the boat, Ben stood beside his father, uncertain of how to bridge the gap. He didn't know if his return was about helping his father or if it was about helping himself. As they set off toward the open water, the boat rocking gently, Ben could only wonder if the silence would ever break. The ocean stretched before them, vast and unyielding, just like the space between them. But still, Ben clung to the hope that one day the quiet might fade away. One crisp early morning, when the air still carried a hint of salt and the sun had barely begun to rise, John set out alone on his boat. It was the kind of morning where the sea seemed still, almost as if it were holding its breath. John had been fishing these waters for more years than he cared to count, and he knew every rock, every current, every swell of the water. His boat creaked as he rode, the only sound besides the occasional call of a seagull in the distance. As John navigated along the familiar coastline, he noticed something odd near the shore. At first, it looked like just another large rock, but something about the shape caught his attention. It was half buried in the sand, its outline too smooth and round to be just another boulder. As he steered his boat closer, John's heart gave a small lurch. The object was too symmetrical to be natural, too deliberate. He docked the boat and waded into the shallow water. Beneath the sand, he uncovered a giant clam unlike any he had ever seen. Its massive ridged surface glistened in the morning sun. John's fingers traced its edges, a deep sense of awe creeping over him. It felt like an ancient relic, something lost to time. For a moment, John simply stood there, unsure of what to do. The sea had always been a reliable companion to him, but this discovery felt different, like fate had drawn him to this spot for a reason. As much as he had lived with the ocean, the feeling of finding something so unexpected stirred something deep within him, something that he hadn't felt in years. Without a word, John decided to take the shell back with him. He carefully lifted it and placed it in his boat, its weight surprisingly heavy, considering how it had been buried in the sand. He didn't know why, but he had a sense that this wasn't just a random find. There was something about the shell that felt important. But he didn't share his thoughts with anyone, least of all Ben. He simply rowed back in silence, the water parting around his boat like the calm before a storm. Back at the house, John stored the shell in the shed, hiding it from view. His mind raced with questions he couldn't answer. Why had the shell been there? Was it simply a freak of nature, or was it something more he couldn't bring himself to tell Ben yet? Not because he didn't trust him, but because John couldn't explain why he felt so compelled to keep this to himself. He didn't want to involve Ben in something he couldn't understand or explain. Over the next few days, John couldn't shake the feeling that the shell was calling to him. Every time he passed by the shed, his eyes would be drawn to it. Something about it seemed almost alive, as if it had a secret it was waiting to share. He would stand in front of the shed, staring at the door, wondering what would happen if he opened it. The more he thought about it, the more he felt the pull of the shell. He knew deep down that it was more than just an oddity, it was something that could change everything. But still, he said nothing to Ben. He kept the discovery to himself, almost as if he was guarding something precious. His days went on as usual, the routine of fishing and repairing the boat. Ben, on the other hand, seemed increasingly restless. The tension between father and son remained thick, and John felt it every time Ben would try to strike up a conversation. He could see the frustration in his son's eyes, the unspoken question of why they couldn't simply reconnect like they once had. But John was lost in his thoughts, preoccupied with the shell and the nagging feeling that it held a deeper meaning. At night, after Ben had gone to bed, John would sit on the porch looking out at the sea. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore seemed to echo the thoughts in his mind. He could feel the weight of the shell pressing on him, even though it was safely tucked away in the shed. Something about it told him that its significance was not just to him, but to Ben as well. But how could he explain it? How could he bring this strange discovery into their fractured relationship one afternoon as the sun dipped lower in the sky? John couldn't stand it any longer. He decided to open the shed door. He needed to see it again to understand why it was calling to him so urgently. When he opened the door, the light from the fading sun streamed through, casting long shadows across the floor. The shell sat there almost glowing in the dim light, and John felt a strange, almost reverent pull toward it. He crouched down beside it, his hands shaking slightly as he traced the intricate ridges of the shell's surface. For a moment it felt as though time had stopped. The air around him seemed to thrum with energy, and in that moment he understood that the shell was not just a random object, it was a catalyst, a sign that something was about to change. But what? What could it be? John took a deep breath, the weight of the decision heavy on his chest. He stood up, walking slowly back to the house, his mind racing with possibilities. He hadn't said anything to Ben yet, but he knew that the time was coming when he would have to. He wasn't sure how to explain it, or even if he could, but he couldn't keep it hidden forever. He just didn't know what to do next. The next morning, John walked into the living room with a heavy look on his face, his steps slower than usual. Ben, who was having his coffee at the kitchen table, noticed immediately that something was different. For the first time since his return, his father seemed unsettled. John's usually steady presence was replaced by something more elusive. Ben frowned, unsure of how to approach the situation. "Dad," Ben asked, trying to gauge his father's mood. "You okay?" John glanced at him briefly before nodding slowly. "I want to show you something," he said, his voice steady but distant. There was a quiet intensity in his tone that made Ben curious. He set his cup down, feeling a strange sense of anticipation growing in his chest. For a moment, it felt like this was going to be one of those rare moments where John actually opened up about something important. Ben followed his father outside to the shed, the familiar smell of salt and wood in the air. As they approached, John unlocked the shed door and stepped inside. Ben's eyes were drawn immediately to the large object wrapped in a weathered cloth sitting on a corner shelf. It was the same shell he had seen weeks ago, hidden away and forgotten, but today it felt different. John pulled the cloth away with slow, deliberate movements, revealing the massive shell underneath. Ben's breath caught in his throat as he took in the sight. The shell, which had looked strange but harmless before, now seemed to hold a certain power. It was large, its curves almost hypnotic. There was something almost otherworldly about it, as if it had come from a time long forgotten. He stepped forward, instinctively drawn in by a curiosity that mirrored his father's. John knelt down beside the shell and carefully pried it open. Ben watched a slight unease building in his chest as his father worked. It felt like they were crossing some kind of invisible threshold. The shell creaked as it opened, and then in the dim light of the shed, something caught Ben's eye, a glint of something bright and mesmerizing. When the shell finally opened wide enough, Ben gasped in shock. Inside, nestled like a hidden treasure, was the largest pearl he had ever seen. It was glowing faintly, its surface smooth and shimmering with an almost ethereal light. The pearl was so large that it seemed to defy logic. It could not possibly have come from a creature of this world, yet there it was, perfectly formed, a radiant orb sitting within the layers of the shell. Ben stepped back, stunned. His mouth went dry as he reached out instinctively but hesitated before touching the pearl. There was something about it that made him feel both awestruck and afraid. John, who had been watching Ben closely, didn't seem surprised, but his face was etched with the same disbelief. The two of them just stood there in silence for a long moment, unsure of what to do next. Ben felt an overwhelming mix of emotions, astonishment, fear, and confusion all tangled together. He finally found his voice, but when he spoke, his words came out shakily. "Dad, this can't be real. It's too big. He struggled to find the right words. It was as if the pearl itself had the power to paralyze him with its sheer size and beauty. John nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the pearl. "I don't know how it got there, Ben. I don't know what it means, but it's here, and it's something special." His voice was soft, reverent, as though he was speaking of something sacred. Ben's mind raced. He could barely comprehend what he was seeing. "But what do we do with it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I mean, is it worth anything? Does it have any kind of significance?" John didn't respond right away. He simply reached out his hand, trembling ever so slightly, as he ran his fingers over the smooth surface of the pearl. There was a deep thoughtfulness in his expression, as though he was processing everything in a way Ben couldn't quite follow. For a brief moment, it almost seemed like the shed had grown colder, as if the weight of the discovery had shifted something in the air. Ben shivered slightly, even though it wasn't cold. There was an eerie stillness in the room, and Ben could hear the sound of his own heartbeat in his ears pounding louder with each passing second. He felt like they had crossed into a new world, one where the rules no longer applied. This pearl. "It's not just a pearl," John said, his voice low and steady. "It's more than that. It's something I don't think we can fully understand yet." Ben looked at his father, his confusion deepening. "But what does that mean? Why is it here? Why now?" John paused, his eyes shifting from the pearl to Ben, his gaze intense. "I don't know. But I think this is going to change everything. For both of us." Ben felt a lump rise in his throat. He wasn't sure if it was the pearl or his father's words, but something in the air had shifted. He wasn't sure if it was good or bad, but he knew one thing: they were standing on the edge of something monumental. Ben stared at the pearl for a moment longer, before he slowly reached out and touched it. The moment his fingers brushed against its smooth surface, a strange sensation washed over him, an electric jolt that made him pull his hand back quickly. It was as if the pearl had a life of its own, a force beyond their comprehension. He stood there, looking at the pearl, and then back at his father. His mind was racing, but the one thought that stood out above all others was the overwhelming fear that this discovery could change everything, not just for them, but for their entire lives. The next few days felt like a blur for Ben and John. The discovery of the pearl had taken on a life of its own. Word spread quickly. and soon the small town felt like it was buzzing with excitement. People who had never shown interest in John's fishing had begun asking questions, their curiosity piqued by the incredible find. But it wasn't just the townspeople who took notice, there were others. People who had their own agendas, their own reasons for wanting that pearl. It started with a letter. Ben had been out on the boat with John hauling in nets of fish when the letter arrived. It was a thick, formal envelope with no return address, just the name of a company in Portland. Inside was a brief, polite note from a group of high-end pearl collectors offering to buy the pearl for a generous sum. They had heard rumors about the discovery, and they wanted to meet in person to discuss a possible transaction. At first, Ben thought it was a joke. He'd been raised in a small town where these types of offers didn't come around often, if ever. But when John read the letter, his face grew serious. He didn't say much, but Ben could see the hesitation in his father's eyes. Ben tried to dismiss the offer. "Dad, we don't know these people. We don't even know if they're legit." Ben had said, his voice laced with skepticism. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. There was too much money involved, too much temptation. But John was silent for a moment, staring at the letter in his hands. Then he folded it carefully, as if putting it away was the only thing to do. The next morning, the doorbell rang, and Ben opened the door to find two well-dressed men standing on the porch. They introduced themselves as representatives of a private pearl collection firm based in Portland. They were here, they said, to discuss the extraordinary value of the pearl John had found. They explained that the pearl had been sought after for centuries by collectors and historians, and they were offering a substantial sum to acquire it, not only for its rarity, but for its potential historical significance. Their interest in the pearl wasn't just monetary. It was tied to its unique origin, something that could change the understanding of ancient maritime trade routes. Their polite smiles couldn't disguise the underlying urgency in their tone. "We've heard about the extraordinary find," one of the men, a tall man with a clean-shaven face and sharp eyes, said, "and we'd like to make you an offer. A very generous offer, I assure you." Ben stepped back, feeling a cold knot form in his stomach. He didn't trust them, not for a second. Something about the way they looked at the pearl, the way they spoke, made him uneasy. But John, ever the calm one, motioned for them to come in. He was taking everything in stride, his face unreadable as they sat down at the kitchen table. "We understand its value," the other man said, a slight grin on his face. "We're willing to offer you a substantial amount of money for it, far more than it could ever fetch in the market. We're talking millions of dollars." The words hung in the air. Millions. Ben's heart skipped a beat. It was more money than they could ever dream of. For a moment, he couldn't believe what he was hearing. The dream of a better life, free from the struggle of living off the sea, flashed before his eyes. With that kind of money, everything could change. They could move away, live somewhere nice, give up the grueling work on the water. Ben glanced at his father, who had been listening intently, but said nothing. "We know it's a big decision," the first man continued, "but think about the possibilities. You could have a life free from all of this. No more fishing, no more struggling, just peace, comfort, and security." Ben's mind raced. He imagined a life away from the constant fight, from the struggles that defined their existence. He thought of the debts, the aging house, the harsh winters. But then his thoughts returned to the pearl, the discovery that had brought them here in the first place. What was it truly worth? Not just in dollars, but to him, to his father. John's gaze flickered to Ben, then back to the men. He remained calm, his fingers tapping lightly on the edge of the table. "I appreciate your offer," he said, his voice steady but firm. "But this pearl, it's not just about the money. It's about something more." The men exchanged glances, the polite smiles slipping just a little. "We understand that this is a difficult decision," the tall man said. "But you have to understand, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. You won't find another pearl like this again. Think of the legacy you could leave for your son, for your family." Ben could feel his pulse quicken. Legacy. The word echoed in his mind, stirring something deep within him. A legacy wasn't just about money. It was about meaning, about something that lasted beyond what could be bought. And yet, the temptation to accept the offer was so strong. John took a long breath and then finally spoke. "No," he said simply. "I won't sell it." The men looked taken aback. They had expected a negotiation, perhaps a bit of back and forth, but not outright rejection. "Are you sure?" the other man asked, his tone shifting slightly. "This is a rare opportunity. Once it's gone, it's gone. Think about the future." John's eyes narrowed slightly. "I've thought about it, and I'm not selling." His voice remained firm, unwavering. "This pearl is part of something bigger. It's not just a piece of jewelry, it's more than that." Ben stood there feeling the weight of his father's words. Something about what John said hit him deeply. It wasn't just the money. It was something intangible, something more profound than wealth. The pearl, in a way, had come to symbolize something John had always known: the importance of family, of preserving what mattered most. The men exchanged another look before standing up, their smiles faltering. "Well, if you change your mind," the tall man said, handing John a business card, "we'll be here. But don't take too long. Opportunities like this don't wait." As they left, Ben stood by the door watching them walk away. His heart was still pounding, but now it was more confusion than excitement. He didn't know whether to feel relief or regret. What did this mean for them? Was his father's decision right, or was it a mistake they'd all regret? It was a quiet night, one of those nights where the only sounds were the soft rustling of the trees outside and the occasional creak of the old house settling. John and Ben had just finished dinner, and the flickering light of the lamp cast long shadows on the walls. John, as usual, retreated to his rocking chair by the window, his eyes fixed on the dark horizon. Ben, unable to sleep, sat at the kitchen table, his mind racing with the events of the past week. The rejection of the pearl buyer had left him unsettled, unsure of what to think or feel. The peaceful night soon turned into something darker. Around midnight, the stillness of the house was shattered by a loud crash at the back door. John's eyes snapped open. For a moment, he couldn't move, his body frozen in the sudden shock of the sound. Ben's heart pounded in his chest as he shot to his feet, instinctively moving toward the door. The intruders were quick, too quick for either of them to react. Before Ben could reach the hallway, a masked man barged into the room, his eyes wild with desperation. "Where is it?" The man snarled, his voice low and menacing. "The pearl. You have it. Where is it?" John stood slowly, his hand instinctively moving toward the drawer where he kept his rifle. But before he could reach it, another figure appeared in the doorway. More men entered, their eyes scanning the room, their faces hidden behind masks. John and Ben exchanged a glance. In that moment, they both knew what was happening. They were being hunted, and not just for the money, but for the secret that John had kept hidden. "We know about the pearl," the first man said again, his voice colder now. "Give it to us, and no one gets hurt." Ben's chest tightened. He wasn't sure what to do. The only thought running through his mind was to protect his father. He lunged forward, grabbing a nearby chair and swinging it at the nearest man. The chair splintered on impact, but it didn't stop the intruder. Instead, the man shoved Ben aside, knocking him to the ground with a brutal force. John rushed forward, grabbing the rifle from the drawer, but his hand shook with tension. The men were closing in on them, their movements quick and precise. "You think you can protect him?" one of them taunted, his voice mocking. "You can't! We'll take the pearl, and you won't be able to stop us." In that instant, something changed in John. The terror for his son, for their lives, surged within him. He could not let them take the pearl. It wasn't just about the money, it was something more. John had a deep, unspoken understanding that the pearl meant something greater, something that would change everything. "Ben, get down to the basement!" John hissed, his voice hoarse with urgency. Ben, still dazed from the blow, shook his head, struggling to get up. "No, Dad, I'm not leaving you." But John shoved him toward the door, his eyes fierce. "Get to the basement now!" Ben hesitated for a split second, his heart pounding before he darted for the hallway. He could hear his father's voice rise in anger as he ordered the intruders to leave them alone. The last thing Ben saw before he bolted down the stairs was his father raising the rifle, his finger on the trigger, aiming at one of the men. Ben's breath caught in his throat, but he couldn't look back. His father had made the decision to fight. John's world exploded in chaos as he fired the rifle. The shot rang out, and one of the men fell to the ground with a thud. But it wasn't enough. The other men were on him in an instant, overpowering him with brute strength. Ben heard the commotion from the basement, the thud of bodies hitting the floor, the harsh shouts of the intruders. He had no time to think. He had to act fast. He rushed to the back of the basement where he knew the hidden panel was. His fingers fumbled and the dark heart hammering in his chest. The panel was just behind a stack of crates. His father had always kept it locked, always told him it was for emergencies, but Ben had never really understood why. Tonight, he understood. He pried the panel open, revealing a small compartment. It was hidden well far from the prying eyes of anyone who might come into their home. Ben's heart stopped when he saw the familiar shape inside the pearl. His father had kept it hidden here all along. But now, it wasn't just a piece of treasure. It was their last hope. Ben grasped it, feeling the smooth surface under his fingers. For a moment, it felt like he was holding the weight of the world in his hands. The sounds from upstairs were growing louder closer. The men weren't far behind, and Ben knew it wouldn't be long before they discovered the basement. He had to make a decision. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't let his father down. He stuffed the pearl into his jacket and moved to the back door, breathing heavily, every muscle in his body tense with fear. Upstairs, John was struggling. The men had him pinned down. He had fought hard, but he couldn't hold them off forever. Ben had to get out of there. He had to save the one thing his father had kept hidden all these years, the pearl. But before he could make a move, a new sound pierced the air, the sound of someone running down the stairs, the sound of feet hitting the floor. Ben froze, his heart thundering. Was it his father, or was it the men coming for him next? After the attack, John and Ben didn't have much time to think. They could hear the men searching the house, shouting and calling for them. The intruders were getting closer, and there was no way they could stay in the house any longer. Ben grabbed his jacket and stuffed the pearl into it, still unsure of what to do next. His mind was racing, his heart pounding in his chest. The decision was made for them when John grabbed him by the arm, pulling him toward the back door. "We have to go, Ben." "Now," John said, his voice low and urgent. Ben didn't argue. There was no time for anything else. They ran into the woods behind their house, their feet crunching through the fallen leaves and twigs. The cool night air bit at their skin, but neither of them slowed down. The quiet of the forest was in stark contrast to the chaos they had left behind, and for a moment it almost felt like they were in a different world entirely. The sounds of the house of the men shouting faded as they put more distance between themselves and the danger. Still, Ben couldn't shake the feeling of unease that clung to him. They were running, but for how long? How long could they hide before the men found them again? John was silent as they moved through the woods, his face set in a grim expression. Ben glanced over at him, but his father's eyes were distant, focused on the path ahead. There was no conversation, no reassurance. Ben was used to the quiet, used to his father's unspoken strength, but now it felt heavier than ever. He couldn't remember the last time they had talked about anything important, and even now as they fled for their lives, there was a silence between them that seemed almost unbearable. They stopped in a small clearing a few miles from the house, the faint moonlight shining through the trees. Ben collapsed onto a fallen log, his breath coming in short gasps. His legs ached from running, his heart still racing with adrenaline. John sat next to him, his face shadowed in the dim light. They both needed a moment to catch their breath, but the weight of everything hung heavily in the air. The tension between them, the unsaid words, was suffocating. Ben sat there for a long time, staring at the ground. He wanted to ask his father what had happened, what had really driven him to keep the pearl a secret, to fight for it so fiercely. But something held him back. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the pearl, something John wasn't telling him. Ben had always thought his father was a man of few words, a man who didn't share much about his emotions or his past. But tonight, after everything that had happened, Ben couldn't help but wonder if there was more to his father than he had ever known. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, John spoke. His voice was quiet, barely above a whisper. "Ben, we need to talk." Ben turned toward him, his eyes wide. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when his father would finally open up. John's gaze met his son's, and for the first time in what felt like years, Ben saw something in his father's eyes, a vulnerability he had never noticed before. John took a deep breath, then spoke again. "I know I haven't been the best father. I know I've kept things from you. But that pearl, it's not just about the money." Ben's heart skipped a beat. He had always suspected that the pearl meant something more than just a valuable object, but hearing his father say it out loud made everything feel so much heavier. "What do you mean?" Dad Ben asked, his voice barely audible. John looked down at the ground, his hands trembling slightly. "That pearl, it's a symbol of hope. For me, for your mother, for all of us. Your mother gave it to me before she passed. She said that it would help us through the hardest times. It's not just a piece of treasure, Ben. It's a reminder that no matter how bad things get, we can always keep going. That's why I've kept it hidden. I didn't want anyone to take it from us. I didn't want it to become something that would tear us apart." Ben listened intently, the weight of his father's words settling into his chest. He had never known about the pearl's connection to his mother, never understood why John had kept it so secret. It suddenly made sense, though. The pearl wasn't just a piece of jewelry, it was a piece of their family's history, a beacon of hope during the darkest times. I thought, John continued, his voice cracking slightly, that if I kept it safe, it would protect us. But I didn't realize that the real protection comes from us, our family. The love we have for each other, that's what keeps us strong. Ben's eyes welled up with emotion. His father's words hit him harder than he had expected. He had always felt the distance between them, always thought of his father as someone who didn't need him, someone who had everything under control. But now, as they sat there in the woods, Ben realized that John had been carrying this weight alone for so long. The pearl was just a symbol, but it was the love and strength of their family that really mattered. "I never told you this because I didn't want to burden you with it," John said, his voice soft but filled with sincerity. "But now, I want you to know that no matter what happens, we're in this together. That's what the pearl really means. It's not about the money. It's about us." Ben nodded, his throat tight with emotion. For the first time in years, he felt like he truly understood his father. The walls that had existed between them were slowly starting to crumble. And though they were still in danger, though they were still running for their lives, Ben felt something inside him begin to heal. They weren't just father and son anymore. They were a family, bound together by something much deeper than fear or uncertainty. As the night stretched on, the two of them sat in silence, the weight of the world momentarily lifted. Ben knew there would still be challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long while, he felt ready to face them. With his father by his side and the pearl hidden safely away, Ben felt that maybe, just maybe, they could make it through anything. After their conversation in the woods, John and Ben found refuge in the hills, but the threat of danger never left. The men who had attacked them earlier were still hunting them, relentlessly searching for the pearl. As much as Ben wanted to fight back, he knew they were outmatched. He had seen his father struggle against the attackers the first time, and though John had always been strong, even he couldn't hold off a group of men who were willing to kill for the pearl. They couldn't keep running forever. They needed a solution, and fast. As the days passed, Ben's mind raced. The idea of giving up the pearl, of sacrificing it to save his father, began to form in his mind. One evening, after another long day of hiding, Ben went out into the woods alone. He needed time to think, to process what had happened. He stood by the river, watching the water flow, the sounds of the forest around him, feeling strangely comforting. But as he stood there, his thoughts were interrupted by the crunch of footsteps behind him. It was his father who had followed him silently. "You've been distant," John said, his voice heavy. "What's going on?" Ben turned to face him, his heart pounding in his chest. He hadn't meant to hide anything, but the weight of what he was about to decide felt too much to share. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them felt thick, the unspoken words hanging like a heavy fog. "I think it's time," Ben said quietly, finally breaking the silence. "I think it's time we give them the pearl." John's face hardened. He stepped closer to Ben, his brows furrowing. "No," he said firmly. "We won't give in to them. You don't understand. If we give them the pearl, they'll have won. They'll take it all, and we'll be left with nothing." Ben swallowed hard, the weight of his father's words pressing down on him. but he couldn't ignore the growing fear, the feeling that the pearl was drawing more danger than they could handle. He had seen what the men were capable of. They weren't going to stop until they had it, and he couldn't bear the thought of his father getting hurt because of it. "I understand more than you think," Ben replied, his voice shaking. "They're going to keep coming. We can't run forever, Dad. We've already lost so much. If we don't give it to them, I'm afraid we'll lose everything." John looked at him for a long moment, his gaze searching Ben's face. The quiet tension stretched between them, and for the first time in what felt like years, John looked like he was on the edge of breaking. "I don't want to lose you," he said softly, almost as a whisper. Ben felt a lump rise in his throat. He had never heard his father speak like that. John had always been strong, always the one holding it all together. But now his father was vulnerable, just as afraid as he was. Ben's heart broke at the realization that they were both carrying the weight of the same fear, the same uncertainty. They were in this together, no matter how alone they had felt for so long. "I'm doing this for you, Dad," Ben said, his voice barely above a whisper. "For both of us." John didn't respond at first. He stood there looking at Ben as if weighing the decision in his mind. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he nodded. "If it's what you think is right, then we'll do it. But we'll do it on our terms. We won't just give it away." The next day, as the men finally tracked them to the edge of the forest, Ben knew what he had to do. He couldn't let his father take any more risks. The men arrived at their hiding spot, their weapons drawn, their eyes scanning the forest. "We know you have it," one of them yelled. "We know you're hiding the pearl. Hand it over and no one gets hurt." Ben stepped forward, trembling, as he pulled the pearl from his jacket. For a moment, his mind raced with thoughts of his father and their family. But he knew the decision was clear. He couldn't let them hurt his father. With a deep breath, he handed over the pearl, knowing its true value was in their safety, not the riches it could bring. "I'll give it to you." Ben said, his voice steady but low. "But leave my father alone. He's not part of this. He doesn't deserve this." The men laughed, their eyes cold. "It's too late for that," one of them sneered. "You should have thought about that before you decided to keep it." Ben's heart raced. He handed the pearl over to the man closest to him, hoping that this sacrifice would be enough to save his father, to end the madness. But as soon as the pearl left his hands, something inside him told him that it wasn't going to be that easy. The men grabbed Ben and shoved him aside, their attention now fixed on John. "Now we take care of him," the man said, stepping toward John, a dark smile creeping across his face. John didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, grabbing a nearby branch and swinging it at the men. The fight broke out in an instant, chaos filling the air. Ben stumbled backward, trying to find his balance, but the men were fast. They overpowered John, quickly forcing him to the ground. Just as things were about to escalate beyond control, a familiar voice shouted through the chaos. "Get away from them." Ben turned, relief flooding through him as he saw Sarah and a group of local fishermen charging toward the attackers. Armed with fishing poles and whatever makeshift weapons they could find, the men from the town rushed in, pushing the attackers back. The fight turned in their favor as Sarah's voice rang out with authority. "Stay down. We won't let you hurt them." John and Ben fought alongside them, the tide of the battle shifting as the local fishermen surrounded the attackers. In the chaos, the men began to retreat, realizing they were outnumbered. But Ben didn't care about the victory. His eyes were locked on his father, and in that moment he realized that everything had changed. After the attack, John and Ben stood together, their eyes reflecting the exhaustion and fear of the past few days. The men who had come for the pearl were gone, but the danger they posed still felt real. The pearl had lost its allure for John. It had become a burden. He knew what had to be done. The decision wasn't easy, but it was clear. John had no choice but to sell the pearl. He had always prided himself on his independence, on his ability to protect his family, but the world had changed. The pearl, once a symbol of survival, had now become a target, and John knew he couldn't keep it any longer. The decision to sell it had been difficult, but the danger it had brought to them was no longer something he could ignore. The money from the sale wasn't just about survival. It was the key to securing their future, ensuring that their family and the community could rebuild without the shadow of violence hanging over them. The local community was struggling, and John had always been someone who believed in helping others when they could. The money from the pearl could be their lifeline, the key to getting the town back on its feet. "I'm going to sell it," John said to Ben one evening as they sat on the porch, the setting sun casting long shadows across the yard. Ben had been quiet for days, still processing everything that had happened. "It's the only way, Ben. We can't keep running. We need to secure our future." Ben nodded silently, his heart heavy. He understood, but part of him still didn't want to let go. He had watched his father struggle with this decision, seen the weight it placed on him. The pearl had meant so much to them, to their family, but the truth was, it had also brought them more pain than they could bear. Ben didn't say anything more. His father's mind was made up, and he couldn't change that. The next day, they made their way to the local museum where the pearl had been kept under lock and key for safekeeping. John felt a pang of loss as he handed over the precious object to the curator. The curator, an older man named Mr. Anderson, was an expert in rare artifacts, and his eyes gleamed with excitement as he examined the pearl. He immediately recognized its unique qualities, but he also seemed to sense something more about it. "This is an incredible find," Mr. Anderson said, his voice filled with awe. "You've done the right thing by bringing it here, John. The museum will make sure it's properly preserved." John stood quietly, his hands clasped in front of him, his gaze fixed on the pearl as it was placed carefully into a secure display case. He felt a sense of finality wash over him. The pearl was no longer in his hands, and with it, a part of his past seemed to slip away. As they stood there, Mr. Anderson motioned for them to follow him to his office. He had something to discuss, something that John hadn't expected. The walls of the office were lined with books on history, artifacts, and priceless treasures. But Mr. Anderson's expression was unusually serious as he turned to face them. "I've been studying this pearl," he began, holding it up in the soft light. "And I can tell you that it's not just a valuable object. It's much more than that. What you have here, John, is a historical artifact. It's a symbol of hope." John looked at the curator, confused. "A symbol of hope?" he asked, his voice tinged with skepticism. Mr. Anderson nodded, setting the pearl down gently on his desk. "Yes, exactly. This pearl has been passed down through generations in certain cultures, and it represents resilience. It's not just about wealth or material value. It's about survival, perseverance, and hope in the face of adversity. This is not just a pearl, it's a piece of history." Ben looked at the pearl with new eyes, a realization dawning on him. He had always seen it as just something valuable, something that could bring them out of their struggles. But hearing Mr. Anderson's words, he began to understand that it was more than that. It had been passed down through time, carrying with it the stories of those who had used it as a symbol to hold on to hope when everything else seemed lost. Mr. Anderson continued, his voice softening. "I can't tell you the full history of this pearl, but I can tell you that it holds a unique power. Not in the sense of magic, but in the sense of meaning. It's a reminder that no matter how dire the circumstances, there is always a way forward. This pearl has been used as a symbol to unite communities, to help them overcome hardships." John felt a lump form in his throat. He hadn't known. He hadn't realized that the pearl was part of something so much larger than their small family, something that stretched back through generations. The weight of the decision to sell it seemed less burdensome now, but it was still hard to let go of something that had been such an important part of their lives. "We'll display it here as part of our collection," Mr. Anderson said, his voice filled with reverence. "But we'll also make sure that it remains a symbol of hope for others, a piece of history that can inspire future generations." John nodded slowly, his heart heavy but at peace. The pearl would live on not just as a valuable object, but as something more, a reminder of resilience, of family, and of the power of hope. After everything they had been through, the silence that had once suffocated Ben now felt like a soft blanket. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of emotions, fear, relief, and ultimately healing. The threat of the pearl had passed, and with the money from its sale, the town had begun to rebuild. People who had once been struggling now had hope. John and Ben had returned to their lives, but everything had changed. Ben had always dreamed of going back to the city to pick up where he left off. But now, after everything that had happened, He couldn't go back to his old life. The job in Portland, the constant grind of the corporate world, it all felt so distant now. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had been living someone else's life for so long. The events with the pearl, the dangers, the realization that his father had always been there for him in ways he never understood had made him reassess what truly mattered. One morning, as the sun rose over the ocean, Ben made the decision. He wasn't going back to Portland. Instead, he was going to stay in town and do something that mattered, something that would help the people who had supported him and his family. He was going to start a project focused on marine conservation and sustainable fishing practices. The sea had always been a part of his life, but it was more than just a resource. Now it was a source of connection, of family, and of future. He sat down with John later that day, explaining his plans. "I've thought about it for a while now, Dad. I'm not going back to my old job. I want to do something that helps the community here, helps the people who've always been a part of our lives. I'm going to start a project to protect the ocean, to help the fishermen find sustainable ways to work with it." John listened intently, his face thoughtful. He had seen Ben struggle with his decisions, had watched him chase something that had never really made him happy. But this was different. Ben wasn't running away from something anymore. He was choosing a path that felt true to him, one that connected him to the people and the place he had once tried to leave behind. "That sounds like a good idea." Ben John finally said, his voice soft but steady. "You've got a good heart. I know you'll make a difference." Ben smiled, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. He wasn't sure where this new path would take him, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was doing the right thing. The past few weeks had been full of hard truths, but they had also given him clarity. The pearl had shown him more than just a way to escape. They had both learned that family, community, and the things that truly matter are worth more than anything money could buy. As Ben sat with his father, a familiar silence settled between them. But it wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was a quiet understanding, a peace that had been hard-earned. Ben had spent so many years feeling like an outsider in his own family. But now, as they shared the same space without words, he realized how much they had both changed. That evening after dinner, Ben and John went for a walk along the beach. The sun had set, and the sky was filled with hues of pink and purple. The waves crashed against the shore, their rhythmic sound calming as it always had. The world felt vast and small all at once, the ocean stretching out before them, endless and full of possibility. "I've never told you this," Ben John began, breaking the silence, his voice almost drowned out by the sound of the waves. Ben looked at him, surprised by his father's words. John had never been one to open up, never one to speak about the past or about feelings. "Your mother used to say that the ocean was a part of us, that it connected us to everything, to all of life." Ben turned to look at him, the words stirring something inside him. He had never known how deep his father's connection to the sea truly was. It wasn't just a job, a way of life. It was part of who John was, part of who Ben was too. The realization hit him like a wave, and he understood for the first time the deep bond his father had always shared with the ocean. "I didn't understand that when I was younger," Ben said quietly, looking out at the water. "I didn't get how much this place meant to you, to us." John nodded, his face softening in the fading light. "It's more than just the fish, Ben. It's the life we've built here, the people, the memories. It's the stories that get passed down. The ocean, it has a way of holding on to everything." They walked in silence for a while, the sound of their footsteps in the sand mingling with the distant crash of the waves. For the first time, Ben didn't feel the need to fill the silence with words. He could feel his father's presence beside him, steady and strong, and for the first time, he felt a deep sense of peace. Ben knew that the decision to stay to begin this new project was just the beginning of a long journey. But as he walked alongside his father under the vast sky and the endless ocean, he felt ready. He wasn't running from anything anymore. He was moving forward, embracing the future with his father by his side and the strength of their family behind him. The future was uncertain, but in that moment, Ben knew that whatever came next, he would face it with his father, with the ocean, and with a renewed sense of purpose. A year had passed since Ben decided to stay. A year since the town had begun to heal slowly but steadily with the help of the marine conservation project he had started. John and Ben had worked together in ways they had never thought possible. Ben had brought new energy to the town, using the lessons of the past to build a better future. With his guidance, the local fishermen had embraced more sustainable practices, and the community had become stronger. But it wasn't just the town that had changed. John and Ben's relationship had transformed too. No longer were they two strangers bound by silence. They had learned to understand each other, to speak and to listen. The bond between father and son was no longer fractured, it was whole. It was a quiet afternoon when Ben decided it was time for them to visit the beach again, the place where it had all begun. The beach that had witnessed the discovery of the pearl, the fights, the losses, and the eventual peace. They stood side by side on the familiar shore, looking out at the ocean as the waves gently lapped at their feet. John, his weathered hands resting on the railing of the pier, sighed deeply. His gaze was distant, but not in the same way it had been all those years ago. There was a calmness in his eyes now, a quiet contentment that Ben hadn't seen before. "I used to come here with your mother," John said, his voice soft, but carrying the weight of years of memories. Ben turned to look at his father, surprised by the words. He hadn't heard John speak of his mother in a long time. "She loved the ocean," John continued, his voice growing fonder as he spoke. "She always said it was where we came from, where we belonged. I didn't understand that until much later." Ben listened closely, feeling a sense of closeness to his mother that he had never experienced before. All these years he had known her only through the stories his father had told him when he was younger, but hearing his father speak now so openly made her feel alive in a way he hadn't anticipated. John paused for a moment, taking in the vast expanse of water before him. "Your mother always said that, no matter how hard life got, the ocean would always bring us back together. And in the end, it did." Ben stood silently watching the waves crash against the shore. He had never fully understood his father's connection to the ocean until now. It wasn't just a livelihood, it was a part of his very being, a source of strength and comfort, just as it had been for generations. Ben thought about everything they had gone through, the pearl, the attacks, the sacrifices, and realized that it wasn't just the physical challenges that had shaped their lives, but the emotional ones as well. He could feel the love his father had for their family, the sacrifices John had made to keep them together. His father had never spoken about his feelings before, but now, in this quiet moment by the sea, Ben understood. It wasn't just about surviving. It was about living with purpose, with love, and with the strength to keep going no matter what. As they stood there, Ben reached into his bag and pulled out a small wrapped package. He handed it to John, who raised an eyebrow in curiosity. "What's this?" he asked, his voice filled with both surprise and suspicion. Ben smiled softly. "It's for you, Dad." John unwrapped the package slowly, his hands trembling slightly as the paper came away. Inside was a painting of the beach, the waves crashing against the rocks, the sky painted in soft hues of orange and pink as the sun set on the horizon. It was a simple painting, but it captured the beauty of the place that had meant so much to their family. John's eyes welled up with emotion as he gazed at the painting. "Ben." His voice broke for a moment and he struggled to find the right words. This is beautiful. I don't know what to say." Ben stood quietly watching his father's reaction. He had never been great at expressing his feelings, but this was his way of telling his father everything he had learned over the past year. That the love they shared, the bond they had forged, was stronger than any material possession. The painting wasn't just a gift, it was a symbol of everything they had gone through together. "I thought you might like it," Ben said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's not just a painting of the beach, Dad. It's a reminder of everything we've overcome, of everything you've taught me, about the ocean, about life, about family." John turned to look at his son, his eyes filled with gratitude and pride. "You've grown up so much, Ben. I'm proud of you, son." For a moment, there were no words between them. The only sound was the waves gently crashing on the shore, and in that moment, everything felt right. The pearl had been a symbol of their family's journey, but it was not the pearl that had held them together. It was their love for each other, their ability to face challenges, and their commitment to a life full of meaning. John looked at the painting one more time, his hand brushing over the image of the waves. "I'll keep this forever," he said, his voice steady, though his eyes were misty. "It's more valuable than any pearl could ever be." Ben smiled his heart full. He didn't need anything else. The ocean, his father, and the love they shared were enough. As they stood there side by side looking out at the horizon, Ben knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together. They had survived, they had grown, and they had learned the most important lesson of all, that family, love, and hope were the true treasures of life. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you think about the twists and turns in the plot? Where are you watching from? Feel free to leave a comment below and share your thoughts.